Hello and welcome, or welcome back to Read Becca. We finished the semifinal round of the Booktube Prize, so I'm here to wrap up my 6 books that I read for translated fiction judging. So I think we're gonna work through the plot summaries initially, and then I'm going to kind of do more critiques as I rank them. So you'll find out exactly how I ranked my 6 books. So let's start first with the ebooks, because I wasn't able to get all of my books physically from my library. I was able to get 5 out of 6 from my library, so that was great. I only had to purchase 1. And starting from The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier and translated by Adriana Hunter from French. However, most of this book actually is taking place in the US. However, it has a very global cast. So it starts from giving us these short stories almost, backstory of individual characters. So you're seeing a day in the life almost of each character, and then at the end of each scene, a Secret Service agent shows up, kind of takes the character away. And all of that, I don't think it's a spoiler to say because it's the title, is because there has been an anomaly. And so this story is really all about the world reacting and figuring out how to process this strange thing that has happened. And that's really what it's all about. This was the most speculative of all the books that I've read so far for the prize. So it was an outlier in that way. It's definitely science fiction. It's definitely philosophical sci-fi in that it's grappling with how the world reacts in a religious context as well. So I would say that's a big element. And so it was definitely unique compared to the other books that I had, which were primarily historical fiction or even kind of contemporary settings. But this is a contemporary near future, maybe. It was written and published with COVID kind of ongoing, so that comes into play here. There is real world politics that's happening now. And so that was interesting as well, because this is kind of the most contemporary near future setting where others have a lot of history involved. So the next one that I have is Inseparable by Simone de Beauvoir and translated by Sandra Smith. And this is a very old book that has just been translated and published. And Simone de Beauvoir is kind of most known for being a feminist existentialist, and this is another French translation, so that's interesting. We had a couple of translated French works, and this is just a slice of time around World War II, these 2 girls in France who become very close friends. And so they have this very intimate friendship, and that's why the title is Inseparable. And so it's about their coming of age, they're coming to understand societal expectations of them and their role in the world. And it's interesting because they're so different, I think, the way their relationship plays out because of that fact. So this one is very short. It's just a tiny novella. So I think that's all I can say about that one without jumping into our critique. The next one I have is The Art of Losing by Alice Zeneder and translated by Frank Wynne. And this one is a generational saga. So this, I think, was the most chunky of my books. It follows 3 generations from Algeria. And this one is all about the French-Algerian colonization and the complexity of immigrant life. So the first generation, adults in Algeria, are dealing with the conflict of Algerian liberation and eventually immigrate to France. And so the next generation have immigrated as children and grown up in France and have a very different relationship with France than their parents do. And then the third generation, being born and growing up in France, is yet again a very different experience. So we follow these 3 generations through that immigrant experience and their different context, I would say, for living in France, and the colonizer versus being their home with the French people, as well as their religion, Muslim religion being perceived by the French and kind of falling away from Muslim religion as they progress in their generations away from that. I think that's all I can say about that one. It's definitely a slow character-focused story following these multiple generations. Then let's talk about my physical books. So the first one is another generational saga. This is More Than I Love My Life by David Grossman and translated by Jessica Cohen. And this is an author from Israel who is writing starting in Israel in this one. However, that's kind of the middle of the story is where we start. The backstory is about the grandmother of the family. So we follow 3 generations again, and the grandmother, we see her fall in love and marry her husband, who is a Serbian soldier. And then war breaks out, and there's all this conflict, and eventually she ends up in a prison island, Goli Otok, off the coast of Croatia. And so she goes through that as a result of kind of being accused of being a Stalinist. And so we see the conflict that's happening politically there and her persecution for that. And then eventually she gets out, and she had left her daughter behind. And as a result, her daughter, Nina, has all of this baggage and damage as a result of that, because her mother was kind of separated from her for this period. And so then we see Nina grow up and increasingly have kind of mental health problems, I would say. It's clear that she's either acting out or is struggling with mental illness as a result. So she grows up, and then we follow her daughter, who is also struggling with the fact that her mother has been absent from her life as a result of this mental illness. And the thrust of this story is all 3 generations coming together to make a documentary. The granddaughter, the 3rd generation, is an adult at the time of that and is going to be in charge of kind of putting together this documentary as they go travel back to Goli Otok, this prison island, and the grandmother is telling them the stories of how she ended up there, how she survived and eventually got out. And so it's this family all coming much closer together as a result of this progression of doing this documentary. So following the 3 generations and seeing snippets of that play out, it's really interesting to see that it's very character focused and about the relationships between the characters. Next we have Where You Come From by Sasha Stanishik and translated by Damien Searles, and we're back in the same region quite a bit. So actually, More Than I Love My Life is her imprisonment takes place in the 1950s during conflict, and here we are kind of back in the same region in the 1990s, early 90s, when Yugoslavia was at war. And so Stanishik is taking us through anecdotes of this young boy who is going through immigration from Bosnia to Germany, and then growing up in Germany and having a normal life there, and then really connecting with his grandmother and going back, traveling back to Bosnia to see the place where he came from, obviously, as the title says, and kind of connect with that as his grandmother, who I believe is in her 90s, is losing her memory. And so she doesn't remember all of this. And so they're kind of trying to reconnect and bring that memory back in some ways, but also show him the place that he has now disconnected from because he hasn't lived there in so long. So I think, yet again, very character focused, very about generations, even though this one is not a generational saga. And you have a real close relationship there. And I think intergenerational familial relationships were a big theme throughout all of these books, pretty much. So that was another interesting element. And my final book is another familial relationship book, How to Order the Universe by Maria Jose Ferrada and translated by Elizabeth Beyer. And this one is tiny, so my second real novella for this list. I had quite a bit of short stuff. I only had 2 long ones. And this one is about this intense period of relationship between a child and her father. And that happens because they started playing hooky, basically. He, instead of taking her to school, begins taking her on sales trips with him. And he's kind of a hardware salesman. He goes and travels around to stores to sell hardware. And so she learns all of the sales practices. She learns how to almost con people and kind of take advantage of manipulating them. We see her get involved with the group of salesmen who are friends with each other and kind of commiserate with each other about their troubles with sales. And so it's this very brief and intense moment of relationship between this child and her parents that is really poignant, I think. And so, as I said, yeah, this is just about encapsulating this moment in time. Okay, so let's talk through the rankings now. And I have to say, these were all good books. We're at the stage where every one of these was a good book. It was competently written. There weren't any real major critical problems other than personal preferences. So this very much comes down to the subjective and just things I didn't like, rather than actual nitpicks that I would have with the writing of the book. So that made it very hard to judge these. And in last place, I think this is going to make at least one person pretty unhappy, but I have The Art of Losing by Alice Senator. So I had a major critical problem with this one, just personally. So let's start with what it did very well is the generational saga part and showing us the progression of the immigrant experience as it carries out through generations. So it really did a great job of showing how each generation moved further away from culture, moved further away from religion, and became more immersed in the culture that they were in. So it did a great job of that. What I hated is that, and I'm sure this is a character perspective rather than an author perspective, I think, it almost entirely sides with the colonizer. And I hated that. I did not like that the reader is pushed to be on the colonizer's side. It made me actively angry. So early in the book, there are pretty frequent info dumps about history and what was going on politically that talk about why France was there and what was going on with France taking over Algeria. When we get to freedom fighting and the liberation forces, it never does that. We never get the grander picture of what the liberation forces were trying to do or what their goal was, that they maybe had a good intention. We don't get that. Instead, through the eyes of the character, at all three generations, for the most part, the liberation forces are young, angry, violent men who are terrorizing their communities. And that is exclusively the view of the liberation forces and the movement. We never get anything else. And even up to the third generation. So we know early on that the third generation, this granddaughter, is going to travel back to Algeria from France and is going at least to see how things are there. And again, we completely get the message that everything is very oppressive and terrible, and the liberation and kind of freedom forces are extremely violent, and everything is bad. So we never get to see that intent of what the Algerian nation wanted as an ideal for themselves. And I feel like that was a massive miss. So on top of that, other big problems for me are that early on in the very first part, we had a kind of violent infant exorcism and a genital mutilation of a toddler. And those things meant that I think they were trying to portray culture. However, they just made me not connect with the characters. I was put off and could not possibly get behind the characters as, they were supporting these things. And that meant I never connected with those characters throughout. And had I been reading this for my own purposes, at that point I would have stopped reading. I would have just given up on the book. And obviously I didn't have that option because of this. So this would have been a DNF for me if I were just reading. And that's why it's here at the bottom, unfortunately. So the next book, and I think this one is going to be yet another controversial one, is Where You Come From by Sasha Stanishik. This was not a bad book. So the rest of the books I had no major problems with. They were all very good books. This one, the main problem that I have is this is a memoir, period. He did not even bother to change names or dates or places. The main character is Sasha Stanishik. So it's a memoir combined with a very short choose your own adventure that does have some speculative elements at the end. And the two do, the memoir does build with this grandmother story, and then the choose your own adventure is focused on the grandmother's experience and this loss of memory. But they feel so just disjointed, utterly disjointed. So I didn't love that. I feel that had this been the choose your own adventure story fleshed out more into a 250 page or 300 page story, or even if it had just been a linear book with the earlier elements of him connecting with his grandmother and coming to understand, her memory loss, and then building into continuing that linear story with the speculative elements from the Choose Your Own Adventure story, it would have been amazing. Like, that would have been a great novel. But instead, it's two separate things. It's a memoir, which shouldn't be on this list at all, because it's not fiction, and then a Choose Your Own Adventure that feels much too brief and underdeveloped. So I enjoyed this. I think this is a very good book, but I don't really think that it was cohesive. So unfortunate, but that's my thoughts on that one. So the next one, or really the next two, I would say, I had the same major issue with both of the novellas, Inseparable and How to Order the Universe, is that they both end very abruptly and feel underdeveloped as a result of being novellas. So I came down with fourth being Inseparable. And that's mainly because it's purely just this story about these two women who are really intensely attached. I feel like it ended where it should have been starting. I wanted so much to see the emotional fallout and processing, and we get none of that. So in addition to that, this has a lot of additive elements. So it has a foreword by Margaret Atwood. It has letters between the two real-life characters this is based on, so Simone and her friend Zaza. And then we have an afterword by Simone's daughter. And without that, again, it feels very underdeveloped. Like, that stuff really creates so much more context for this and definitely adds value to this, that judging purely the work of the actual author, it just doesn't have the same level of quality without that added context. So that's why this ended up in fourth place. And that means that How to Order the Universe ended up in third place. And I felt like this was just so good at capturing that moment in time. I kept comparing this back to one of my earlier Booktube Prize books, 3 o'clock in the morning, where we also had an intense, brief period between a father and son, and it was about capturing that moment. And this one felt much more effective and more true in its portrayal. It really felt believable, that relationship between them and the way that it ends. But again, it's so abrupt in the end. Like, it feels underdeveloped, and I wanted more. I wanted to see how her life goes on, and we didn't get that. So yeah, it was very good. This one is very quirky and different. She's really humorous. So this was one of the few light reads on the list that I had, and I just attached to this character so much. So yeah, I thought it was very good. So in second place, I have The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier, and this is just fun sci-fi. It's really entertaining, and the way that it's framed in the telling is just pulling you along as a reader, I would say. So you're gonna have a great time if you read this. My main critique of this that made it not go into first is that it feels like it's been done before. Like, for me, this is probably a literary author who's not as familiar with genre, and so feels like they're doing something really new and fresh, and this is all stuff I've seen before in sci-fi. And so it was a great book. I really enjoyed it, but it didn't feel super fresh or new. And finally, what that means for you is that my first place pick is More Than I Love My Life by David Grossman. And yeah, I just loved this. I connected with the characters so much. I thought there was this constant tautness in the relationships between every character here, and yet they love each other so deeply. So generational sagas are not my thing at all, and yet I loved every moment of this. This is really slow and character focused though, so you kind of have to be on board with the characters for this. So I don't think this is going to be for everyone, but I did. Like, I just attached to those characters so much. I felt so much empathy for the difficult situations each of them was put into, the traumas that they went through that were carried down through the generations was just done so well. And so yeah, I loved everything about this. I love the setting, and the sense of place is really there in this book more than any of the other books that I had. So yeah, I just kept comparing this to other books that I've read through the whole prize, and I think this is my favorite of both rounds that I have judged, in fact. So yeah, More Than I Love My Life is my #1 pick. So that is my Booktube Prize ranking and wrap up. Thank you so very much for watching.